So welcome everybody. Very happy to have with me Conor Allen for the Brussels Liberty Network, hosted by Brussels Report, RIKS Europe, Tolos Foundation. So first we'll have the and Happy New Year, first of all, of course, to everybody. First, Conor will discuss and give a keynote with some Q&A. And then after that, we'll have the off-the-record roundtable, as always. So I've asked Conor to speak about the fate of the European car manufacturing industry. He has been working in the car manufacturing industry world for Honda. He's very knowledgeable. He has seen from the inside how the decision-making process at the EU level played a big role in what we are seeing today, which is very big and deep problems in car manufacturing, which was once one of the crown jewels of European industry. So yeah, that said, I won't reveal much, but I'll give the word to Conor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, for turning up on this very cold January morning. It's very much appreciated. Thanks, Peter, for inviting me to speak. Peter is a champion of liberty and small government here in Brussels, and we need more people like him, I think. And then a special thank you to the co-hosts from the Tholos Foundation as well. Founded by my personal hero, Ronald Reagan. So I'm always happy to engage with them. I don't like to make long speeches, so you'll be very, very happy to know that. You won't have to listen to my disgusting Manchester accent for too long. To be honest, I always get self-conscious as well that I'm sending people to sleep. But if there's one topic where I really urge you to stay awake and pay attention, it's the European automotive industry. The topic of today's meeting, I think you said, was the demise of Europe's car manufacturing industry. And this could not be more apt. It's one of Europe's most important sectors. So 13.2 million jobs from the automotive industry in Europe. And is anyone from Slovakia in the room? Nope. So in Slovakia, that goes even higher. So 15% of all jobs in Slovakia depend on the European automotive manufacturing industry, and the Japanese Toyota are there. 33% of Europe's total R&D spending is a result of the automotive industry, which creates even more jobs and even more spend. And it's estimated at around 10% of all European economic output is as a result of cars, automotive industry. I cannot overstate how important that this industry is to Europe, and I cannot overstate how damaging what I call the toxic trio are to this industry. That's number one, overregulation, number two, protectionism, and number three, overtaxation. But nonetheless, I will try to state it in this small speech. So I'll briefly introduce myself, and then I'll address that toxic trio. Again, I want to keep this quite light and high level. I don't want to go into too much technical detail, but if you are interested and you do want a deep dive, I recommend the ASEA website. ASEA is the Automotive Constructors Association here in Brussels, and also the think tank EQIP, the European Centre for International Political Economy, who do focus on this, and for people with our...
Or ESIP.
ESIP?
Yeah.
Okay. I call it a keep.
Okay.
It sounds better. And for people with our kind of political leanings, they are quite amenable to us as well. So to introduce myself, my name is Conor Allen, as Peter said. I worked for Honda for several years. I now work for another very large Japanese conglomerate, who you might have identified because I was accidentally wearing a badge before, but I'm not representing them today. I'm representing myself. But we make EV charging, we make car parts, we're automotive adjacent, as well as many other products. As part of my role at Honda, I lobbied on things such as the Green Deal, the internal combustion engine ban, digital legislation, CSR legislation, all the things affecting the automotive industry today. And before Honda, I was in the European Parliament for 2 different MEPs, both British, 1 Liberal Democrat, I'm very sorry, and 1 Tory, which was quite a nicer experience. But of course, you don't care about me. You're here today to talk about cars. I've just mentioned how important the automotive industry is to Europe. And as with everything with the European economy, I'm afraid I have bad news, outright depressing news, in fact. So the EU has around 250 automotive factories, right? Many are in Hungary, many are in Germany. The lion's share are in Germany, I think around 50 are in Germany. But in the last few years, we're seeing all of these facilities, no exceptions, imperiled. Volkswagen announced as a special Christmas surprise that they're reducing 35,000 jobs in Germany alone. 35,000. The Audi plant in Brussels will, of course, close on the 28th of February. Stellantis suspending production at its main plant in Italy. Ford cutting 4,000 jobs. Daimler cutting hours and imposing a hiring freeze. Bosch and Schaeffler, which manufacture automotive parts, cutting around 5,000 jobs each. Michelin, a further 2,000 job cuts. And of all the factories that remain, there's a Bloomberg article a few months ago which revealed that on average they're operating at 1/3 capacity of their total. Across the board, there is a decline in production and sales, and it's sent a ripple throughout the supply chain. The global semiconductor shortage, exacerbated by geopolitical tensions and supply disruptions, has constrained vehicle manufacturing. Meanwhile, we have fluctuating energy prices and inflation that have dampened consumer purchasing power, leading to reduced demand for new vehicles. But this is felt quite globally. You also see these things in the US, you see it in China too. So what is it about Europe that's killing the automotive industry? Why are European manufacturers' facilities so damaged? Well, this is where I introduced the toxic trio. Overregulation, to begin with, the first of those 3. And for those of you who don't like net zero, I include net zero in this kind of portion as well. But before we start to think about net zero and environmental legislation, let's think about the more mundane aspect of regulation, which is compliance with that legislation. I've worked for Japanese companies for quite a while now. It's been about half a decade since I left the Parliament. And every so often you get like a phrase or a concept that's reported in the Japanese media, it filters down, and suddenly every Japanese person is like repeating this one thing and asking me about it. So for the last 5 years, that's been European regulatory tsunami. They like the fact that we use the word tsunami. Each car manufacturer in Europe now has to comply with about 100 pieces of legislation. That is only the EU level. There are also national legislations on top of that. These will cover safety, emissions, energy, minerals, data security, type approval. I could go on all day. We only have a couple of hours, don't we? It's very common to have dedicated, specifically regulatory compliance departments in car manufacturers in a way that isn't necessarily common elsewhere in manufacturing sectors. So, for example, in my company now, we would comply in the factories, would have someone doing that work and making sure the products are up to standard. But car manufacturers tend to have specific corporate silos for regulatory compliance. Take BMW as an example. They have a huge office in Schumann Square. They have around 50 employees dedicated solely to looking at EU legislation and complying with it. None of these people are making money for the business. I don't make any money for my businesses, right? Like we have very abstract value. All we're doing is complying with legislation. Now, when I worked for Honda, I worked out that Honda has to sell maybe between 20 and 30 civics in order to sustain just me. So when you're talking about 50 people doing regulatory compliance, how many X5s does BMW have to sell in order to make its money back, just to draw even on regulatory compliance? I don't know, because I don't know their profit margins, but I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. The most egregious example of these regulations, and again, I'm not going to go into all of 100 of these, is CSR, corporate sustainability reporting. If any of you have ever heard of CSRD, yeah, some flash, some panic in your eyes there. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but for far more burdensome are due diligence requirements in the supply chain. So cars are quite complex, you know, compared to most products on the market. They have lots of different parts. You know, you think of the tyres, the seat belts, the seats, engine, all different parts in the engine. Hello. The steering wheel, all of these are separate components that have to be assembled. So there might be thousands of parts. Manufacturers now need to conduct due diligence exercises throughout their supply chain, right? And so maybe if you're manufacturing tools in the EU, you'll have 3 layers of the supply chain. You'll have the hammer, which comes from a factory. They source the steel here, the rubber for the handle here. In the most complex bits of the automotive supply chain, you'll have 13 to 14 layers. And now you have to conduct due diligence exercises throughout all of them. So many car companies have created a dedicated business function, apart from the regulatory compliance, just to comply with sustainability reporting. So at Honda, the team's now grown to about 11 or 12 people. And again, how many Civics do you have to sell in order to just comply with this legislation? The best part is this was done as part of the sustainable finance package in the EU. You go to investors and you say, is this helpful for you? Is there a market for green investment? And they say, yes, there is, but we don't use these statistics. We have our own ways of working it out and we don't use this data. Brilliant. So car manufacturers are losing millions upon millions of euros every year just through complying with infinite, non-streamlined, burdensome, and very often useless pieces of legislation. It would help if some of those 100 pieces of legislation were merged into one. We have legal problems because definitions in one piece of legislation don't comply with definitions in another piece of legislation. Which means we have we literally cannot comply with legislation. I say we. I'm still thinking from a Honda perspective. But there is one benefit to CSR, and it allows me to kind of segue quite nicely into environmental legislation. So I'm going to talk mostly about the internal combustion engine ban. So in 2035, car manufacturers will no longer be able to sell internal combustion engines on the market. Even extremely efficient hybrids, you know, we're talking about 95% reduction in emissions, not allowed under this 2035 rule. Let's see if it changes soon. I bet it will. But can you imagine a group of people in the Berlimont? They've never driven a car in their lives, most of them. They cycle to work, and they think that they can tell the state of the market in what was 15 years' time back then, now it's 10 years' time. I can't tell the state of the market in 10 years' time. My CEO can't predict how a market will evolve over 10 years. But if you go to the Berlimont, they can. Using data sourced from such wonderful environmental NGOs as Transport and Environment and so on.
EU funded.
EU funded, NGOs, exactly.
So, governmental, non-governmental organizations.
Exactly. That was a good joke. We should get that on the microphone. So we lobbyists, and I'm quite sad that Jan Badinsky isn't here, we pointed out time after time to them the problems with this phase out. There's no EV infrastructure. Where are we going to get the critical raw materials from? At the time, we're talking about Congo and children who wake up every morning, pick up a tool and go to artisanally mine cobalt. Consumers don't like them. They're very expensive. Does anyone in here have an electric vehicle? No? Thought not. No one likes them. No, they're good to drive, but they're very, very expensive, right? Maybe 2-3 times more costly than an internal combustion engine. And the range is crap, right? Like if you want to drive to Antwerp and back, you're struggling. So consumers don't like them. We received responses from the Commission. This is a literal quote from an official who won't be named. Well, you're the car industry. You can afford to dig into your pockets. Brilliant.
The ultimate argument.
Yes, exactly. Why not just pay a bit more, guys? So the best part is the day after the 2035 ICE ban was passed, transport NGOs, the one I mentioned before, Transport and Environment, suddenly found quite a lot of data saying that EVs might actually have increased emissions because they're heavier vehicles and the tyre contacts the road more often. So now we have to have more legislation on tyre emissions and particles. Yeah, you're seeing the regulatory circular economy, exactly. Hello. Yes, and of course the main beneficiary of this is the big four consultancies who also input into the regulatory creation process. The 2035 ban, in my opinion, is the most egregious example of government overreach in living memory. And the thing is, across the world, not only are electric vehicle sales already increasing, but very efficient and very good hybrid sales are also increasing. So for all the legislation, we're not actually doing as good as China or as good as the United States. Without equivalent legislation, they're still making strides. Hybrid vehicles can reduce tailpipe emissions, like I said, by around 90 to 95%. They're an awesome technology. They provide a nice, smooth, intermittent transition from ICEs to EVs. If you develop a hybrid, you can also develop a more efficient EV over time. So whilst America is profiting immensely from customers adopting hybrids, and it makes sense for you as a consumer because you're paying less fuel, right? Like fuel's quite expensive if you live in Europe. Here in Europe, manufacturers don't bring hybrids to market because on average you have to manufacture a car type for 7 years to make your money back. We have 10 years until the 2035 ban. So what's the point? Right? Like you're not going to make as much money. You're going to make your money back slightly. So that's the first of the toxic trio, overregulation.
So the ban to try to rush it is actually slowing down the development, absolutely. You could argue. Yeah.
Even if you take solely the environmental perspective, it's inhibiting our ability to cut transport emissions.
Even assuming that the total environmental cost of an EV is lower than a combustion engine car, which is a questionable assumption. Right?
Indeed, indeed, exactly. And the thing is, transport emissions, they are 30% of Europe's total emissions. So when you talk about the 2035 ban, if you set the target for 2035 at 90%, it means you can bring hybrids to the market. It means you can reduce these emissions by 95%. But because they've gone so, I would use the word fanatical, but that's me being over dramatic. In fact, it's almost like the Lafleur curve. You've done too much, and it's inhibiting the ability to deliver on emissions reduction.
Okay. So the same is true for like trucks and heavy vehicles, or
no? I'm speaking mostly on road transport, on cars and vans here. With trucks, it's different because you have hydrogen thrown into the mix as well. I didn't want to go too much into it because we don't have such time. But you are right. There is a differentiation here. Trucks and other large hard to electrify transport sectors. They're not really looking at battery electric, though. There is a battery electric market for trucks, but if you think of aviation or shipping, that's all hydrogen. So the second of the toxic trio that I mentioned is protectionism, right? So Europe exports around 200,000 vehicles per year currently. In 2020, the automotive sector accounted for 50% of the EU's total trade surplus. So Europe and the European Union does not have a trade surplus. The automotive sector of the EU does. It is singularly the most important industry in terms of export revenues for the European Union. Yet the Commission is pursuing protectionist policies that will damage not only the European consumer, but imperil this vital flow of export revenue. So to give an idea of what these policies look like, we've just nakedly raised tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, right? We've implemented a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will eventually be extended to vehicles. Not currently, but eventually will be.
If Trump will not kill this.
If Trump will not kill this. I have a lot of hopes riding on...
I don't think Trump has heard about the CBAM. Otherwise, he would have already announced that this has to go.
No, exactly. Well, this is the point. This is the point. The Commission passes a CBAM, and Donald Trump hears about it. Suddenly, we're one step closer to those 20% universal tariffs. Of course. Because the Commission, and this is a point I had later in my script, so I'm a bit annoyed you brought it up early. The Commission thinks it can do what it wants, and no one's ever going to respond. We set all the rules and all the restrictions and all the barriers to trade. And no one else can do this, right? Like, it's not like China can put tariffs on us if we put tariffs on them. This is the actual genuine thinking of the Commission. And yet, now we're seeing it unravel, because what does China do? In response to the electric vehicle tariffs, they can just turn around and prevent access to germanium and gallium, which, of course, incredibly essential to our defence industry. They can put tariffs on European brandy, wine, and the other sector. We tend to have very spiky and very obvious specialty products in the EU that can be very easily targeted. And guess which one is the greatest, which accounts for 50% of the EU's trade surplus? It's the automotive industry. This is a result of the EU merging trade policy, environmental policy, industrial strategy into one thing. You will often find measures buried deep in environmental legislation that serve as a trade barrier. They're disguised and hidden. So one example of this is the battery regulation. So there is sorry, I'm going way too technical now. There is a stipulation in the battery regulation that eventually 90% of the lithium in that battery must come from recycled content. The only facilities in the world where that is possible is in the European Union. It's a non-tariff barrier to trade. I think they actually got rid of that one. But it's just an example of the type of things that you will find if you dig deep enough in any given piece of legislation. Let's head back to BMW for a second, who now openly lobby the German government for less trade restrictions because, why? Because they have to operate in China, right? The EU, as the European market declines, we went from 1/3 of all global automotive sales 10 years ago to 1/5 today. Manufacturers have become dependent on outside markets. BMW has to make its money in China. Honda makes its money in the US, but we don't care about them, they're Japanese. It used to be the case that European manufacturers could export to these markets. You could build a car in Germany and ship it off to China. Now that's not possible. Now you have to have a facility in China dedicated for the Chinese market. And this is a result of the global collapse of free trade as well.
That's because of Chinese measures.
Partly from Chinese measures, but it's all interlinked, right? If Europe is setting restrictions and China responds with restrictions, the point is the collapse of global trade and the embrace of protectionism is what's really inhibiting European automotive manufacturers. But we justify, well, in fact, it's a good point. We justify these measures because we say, well, China sets restrictions too. China nakedly gives its companies state subsidy, right? So we also in Europe must level the playing field, and we must also impose restrictions, right? But the fact is, we've never ever had to compete with Chinese products fairly. In my lifetime, certainly, I'm only 32, but certainly looking around the table, I don't think any of us have had a time where European and Chinese products were competing fairly on the open market. But we've always won out, and we've always done well because European or Western companies are closer to the consumer. Chinese companies don't have to make a profit, right? The state will absorb their losses. But that means you're responsive to the state. It doesn't mean you're competitive. It doesn't mean you're innovative. It means that when the government clicks its fingers, you do what they say. We have undermined our great advantage in that BMW and Volkswagen, and I'll say Ford as well, they know what the customer wants. They know what they like. They know how to streamline a production process, and they know how to deliver a very cheap and very good product. We have Italians in the room, right? The Fiat Panda. How often do you still see Fiat Pandas around? I go to Umbria quite often. I see them quite often.
We have lost the Italian automotive industries 15 years ago, more or less.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like Ferrari now, you can consider Italian. The rest is no longer Italian.
Well, exactly. But you still see a lot of these old marks still in usage, still there, because it was a bloody great product. You find the same with Honda Civics. You find Renault Clios, Ford cars. But what do we have these days? We have BMW runs to the state, demands subsidy, and he gets it. European governments are more than happy to splash their cash on whichever company queues up first, or to impose restrictions, or to impose legislation, because we're no longer responsive to the consumer, we're responsive to the state. In trying to tackle China, we are becoming China. But now that I've mentioned government spending, I'm going to move on to point 3 of the toxic trio, which is overtaxation. I did try to make this not boring, and I did try to prevent you from falling asleep and to keep it short. So you'll be very glad to know this is a very, very short point. Because taxation isn't a specific automotive thing. And in fact, of all the taxes that flow into state coffers from BMW, from Volkswagen, they probably get quite a lot of it back through subsidy these days. But Europe as a destination market for cars has declined. 10 years ago, 1/3 of all automotive sales done here in Europe, now 1/5, and decreasing. We're taxing our citizens into poverty. We're passing environmental legislation, which means they're paying triple, quadruple the cost on their energy. Right? I pay my grandma's heating bill, although she lives in the UK and there's more issues around that. The idea that the average European has the spending power to go out and buy a new car these days is just not the reality, is it? Part of the reason of this is high taxation. If we want to maintain our status as a premium market, we need to have consumers with enough money to spend. And part of that is taxation. And that's all I have. So thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry to be so bloody depressing, and I'm so sorry to if I was perhaps boring during that. But I did say at the start, right, like if you're going to pay attention to one thing, particularly over 2025, pay attention to the automotive industry, because this is a real danger for all of Europe. I mean, think about it: 13.2 million jobs imperiled. if you have a factory that's running at 1/3 capacity, how long do you make a loss in order to keep the bet going that in a few years it'll all be sorted out? I'll leave that as a nice rhetorical question and end. So if you have any questions, happy to answer any. But
all right, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Connor.